Hey everybody, welcome to the first ever episode of the SuperBake Podcast. I'm your host, Baker. This is a show that I've been wanting to do for a while. I've always wanted to make a podcast, and I finally took the time to do it. So what this is going to be, to give a slight introduction to the show itself, is I'm a huge fan of everything entertainment, movies, video games, books, TV shows, and things of that sort. So I've always loved talking about them with people, so I figured what better way to do it than to create my own podcast show doing it. So I do plan on doing this at least once a week, hopefully try to release every Friday if possible. If anything changes in that schedule, I'll certainly keep you updated on that. But if you like what you hear, feel free to like and subscribe. Would definitely appreciate the support. So without further ado, the very first episode is going to be about the new Spider-Man film, No Way Home. I have seen the previous movies, Homecoming and Far From Home, and so I figure what better way to start my podcast off than to discuss what I consider to be one of the best Spider-Man films that come out in recent memory. So let's get to it. So basically, some minor details on the movie. Well, not minor; these are pretty major. Directed by John Watts, who did direct Homecoming and Far From Home. Starring, of course, for anybody who doesn't know, Tom Holland, Zendaya, Benedict Cumberbatch, aka Doctor Strange, Marissa Tomei, as well as several others who I will get into a little bit later. The movie had a budget of $200 million, and as of the time of recording this podcast, has made over $895 million. Probably 900 by now, I would imagine. And just a kind of a heads up, whenever I discuss movies like this, or really anything entertainment related, there probably will be major spoilers. So if you haven't seen Spider-Man No Way Home, just consider this a friendly heads up. I am going to be discussing the plot in pretty great detail. So if you haven't seen it yet and you want to go into it not knowing anything, I do recommend not listening to this podcast because there are going to be some pretty major spoilers ahead. So anyways, going into the plot of the film, of course, this picks up pretty much immediately after Far From Home left off, where basically Mysterio had revealed the identity of Spider-Man as Peter Parker. And the film basically revolves around Peter trying to figure out a way to make the entire world forget who he is. Because basically, the movie starts off with him and his entire life has basically just been turned upside down. Him, Mary Jane, and his friend, whose name I forget. Basically, the three of them, their lives have been completely flipped upside down. It's impacted them. Knowing who Spider-Man is basically impacting their life in every way, from like their social lives to even them trying to get into college. So basically, the film is about Spider-Man trying to figure out a way to get his life back to normal. And basically, he meets up with Doctor Strange, discusses with him about a spell that can basically help him erase the memories of everybody who knows who Peter Parker is. Unfortunately, things, as they normally do in these types of films, go horribly awry. The spell gets botched, and characters, also mostly villains from previous Spider-Man films, start showing up into Peter Parker's world, and he basically has to try to send the villains back into their respective universes. This film, I believe, is supposed to be kind of a lead into the multiverse aspect of the Marvel comics, because the next movie coming out in the Marvel universe is going to be Doctor Strange, Multiverse of Madness, and this film is kind of a nice segue into that aspect, and it's done pretty awesomely, I think. So basically, the very first film that we're introduced to from the previous films was Alfred Molina's Doc Ock, which was really cool to see. It was a nice callback to Spider-Man 2 from the early 2000s, and I really liked seeing that a lot. He definitely looks quite a bit older, but he still bears the same menacing threat that he did back in the Spider-Man 2 days, so it was really cool seeing him again. And then, of course, we're introduced to Green Goblin, who is, of course, portrayed by Willem Dafoe, returning to play the iconic role from the very first Spider-Man film. And seeing these two titans of the Spider-Man film universe was really awesome to see. And then, of course, we get to see a few other villains that show up later on. The Lizard from the Amazing Spider-Man films, who is, again, portrayed by the actor that played him in that movie, as well as Jamie Foxx's Electro, who also shows up. And then we're also treated to the Sandman from Spider-Man 3, whose role is reprised by what is his name? I should know this guy's name by now. I know he was in Tombstone. I'll have to look it up later. Apologies on that. But anyways, yes, these people do come back. It's the same characters, the same actors from the previous films. Um, Thomas Hayden Church, that is the guy's name. I don't know why I forgot that. I'm usually very good about remembering actors' names, but yes, the actors that played them in their previous films, they do show back up and they do reprise their roles in this film, and it's really cool to see them. They do look quite a bit older, but they still maintain a lot of their characteristics from the characters in the first few films they were in, so it was definitely awesome to see that. And so basically, Spider-Man is trying to figure out a way to get these guys back into their respective universes. And then, of course, Doctor Strange tells him that they need to go back immediately. And then it's discovered from the villains that if they go back, they do end up getting killed by their respective the Spider-Man from their universe. Peter, of course, being the good guy, doesn't want to send them back to die, so he's trying to figure out a way to help them, to cure them essentially of being villains. Doctor Strange thinks this is a terrible idea, doesn't believe that this will help anybody, and wants to stop him and fix the space-time continuum. And then from there, there's a kind of a short conflict between Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, where the two are kind of at butting heads on what the right move is. And then, of course, as many of you can probably predict, things go wrong when the villains escape and then have their own little scheme that they've hatched to try to throw Peter Parker's plans, to try to ruin Peter Parker's plans. So that is the plot in overall, and it's done very well. Now I'm going to kind of get into a few things about the film that I enjoyed, and then a few things about it that I would either change or maybe just didn't really like too much. And this is going to kind of be the format that I'm going to have for a lot of reviews going forward. So basically, I'll just start off with a few positives that I have with the movie. And these definitely there's a lot of them for sure. I mean, first off, I would definitely consider this easily to be one of the best Marvel films that I've seen in many years. And the last Marvel film that I saw in theaters was Avengers Endgame. Yeah, I saw that I think back in 2019, so it was just before the pandemic hit, which is kind of a sad thought to have. But I would definitely consider this to be one of the strongest Marvel films in recent memory. And the acting all across the board was really good in this film. Again, I think Tom Holland is definitely a fantastic Peter Parker. He definitely has some great raw moments in this film that you really feel for the character. And then, of course, I mentioned before when I was talking about the cast, I didn't want to mention a few actors that were in this movie because it would have been major spoilers, at least the beginning of my episode. But since we're already in spoiler territory, I'm going to get into this next part. For those of you that haven't seen it yet and are curious, yes, Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire are in this movie. They reprise their roles as their respective Spider-Men. And this is one of the positives I have about the film. Seeing these two come back was really awesome, especially Tobey Maguire. You know, I haven't seen him in a lot of movies in recent memory, so seeing him in this it was really cool. It was a good feeling. I was sitting in the middle of a fairly crowded theater, and everybody just started cheering. Like, the crowd just erupted in applause, seeing him and Andrew Garfield come back. And it was a cool scene. Like, I'd be lying if I said I didn't get a little emotional seeing that again. So yeah, and then, of course, I said the acting was great. I'm going to give props to, I think, two performances in particular in this film. One was Willem Dafoe, who I think is just fantastic in everything that he's in. He comes back as the Green Goblin, and while he definitely looks quite a bit older, he still maintains a lot of that menace that he had in the first Spider-Man film. It's that campy comic book like villainy, but it's still great. And he just is eating up the scenery, every scene that he's in. And then the other acting kudos that I have to give to, I think, is definitely going to be Andrew Garfield. He really surprised me with the amount of emotion that he brings into this film. There's a few callbacks to some of the previous Spider-Man films, and not just No Way Home and Far From Home and Homecoming. There's even nods to the original Spider-Man trilogy as well as the Amazing Spider-Man films. Mainly in that The Amazing Spider-Man 2, when Andrew Garfield's character is unable to save Gwen Stacy and she falls to her death. In this movie, I'm not going to give away too much about it, but there's a particular scene that really is a nice callback to that. It's a cool, heartfelt moment that I think if you haven't seen The Amazing Spider-Man, it might go over your head a little bit, but for people who have, I think it's definitely going to be a nice emotional moment. At least it was for me. It was a cool callback, and it was really nice, and it was handled, I think, very well in the film. I think people who have seen The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and go and watch this, I think you'll understand what I mean when you see the scene. Yeah, and then I think another big positive about the film is just that it was a really fun film to watch, which I think is something that a lot of films have been lacking lately, especially in the Marvel universe. Um, I have not seen Eternals yet, but I heard that film was not the best in terms of what you would come to expect from a Marvel film. I feel like a lot of superhero movies have kind of been lacking this lately. This film just was fun to watch. It kind of had the same vibe as, at least a similar vibe to Into the Spider-Verse, which is one of my favorite superhero films like ever made, just period. So I think the fact that this kind of gets into the multiverse was really cool, and it had that same feeling as like Into the Spider-Verse. It kind of had. I feel like Marvel films are kind of starting into getting to kind of weird territory, and I'm kind of into it. Honestly, I support it. So now, as far as some of the negative aspects of the film, this is mostly going to be kind of me just nitpicking. Um, I'm sure people are probably going to disagree with me on some of these that I have to say about the film. These are just my opinion. If you don't agree with me, that's perfectly fine. This is just kind of what I thought about the film. The first one would be I would have liked to have seen a little bit more Doctor Strange in this film. He is definitely advertised as having a much bigger role than he had, I believe. At least I feel like in the trailer, it felt like they definitely implied that he was going to have a much bigger presence in this film, and he's really not in it a whole lot. It's not a huge problem, but I just would have liked to have seen more of him. Mainly, there's one big action scene where it's basically Spider-Man kind of going up against Doctor Strange, and it's a really cool action scene, but it's very short. In which you see Doctor Strange kind of use a lot of his tricks against Peter Parker, including the mirror dimension, which was really cool to see. And I just kind of feel like there was a lot of wasted potential there. The idea of seeing Spider-Man web slinging through the mirror dimension, I think would have been really cool to see more of that. They give you a slight taste of it, but it would have been cool if they could have just done a little bit more with it. There's a lot of just untapped potential there they could have done. Another thing was I felt like there were just a few too many scenes in the movie where they kind of put in the Marvel humor. And what I mean by that is it's like scenes where there's like where somebody has to make like like a quick joke or something like that, or some kind of pun or something. Like an example is in one of the trailers, there's a scene where Doctor Strange says, Scooby Doo this shit. And it's like, the scene in the movie, I mean, it's okay, I guess. It gets a few chuckles out of the audience, but that's kind of the example of like that, what I call the Marvel humor, where it's like, it's that humor that kind of feels like it's placed in an otherwise serious scene to try to bring some lightheartedness to it, but it feels kind of out of place. And in some cases is even a little awkward. I feel like there were a few too many moments like that in this movie. They weren't, I mean, there weren't a lot, and they certainly weren't distracting by any means, but I just kind of felt like I personally noticed them. But I'm sure a lot of people won't. So, I mean, if you don't, more power to you. That's just something that I kind of noticed about this film. Then another negative aspect I would say would be, and it's kind of going along with the first thing that I mentioned about not using the multiverse aspect. It would have been cool if we could have gotten a little bit more of the weird multiverse part of this movie. It feels like the main focus is really kind of on Spider-Man trying to help these villains from the previous films, but they're in this movie as a result of him and Doctor Strange kind of tapping into the multiverse, and that aspect of the film, the multiverse aspect, really isn't explored very much. So it would have been kind of cool if they could have gone into that a bit more. I guess I understand why. It's because they're kind of building up to it in the next film, which is going to be Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which I get that. That's fine too, but it still would have been kind of cool to see it. Again, because you have a character like Spider-Man who is basically known for web slinging and moving about in really awesome acrobatic ways. The idea of seeing him moving through the multiverse would have been really cool. But I guess we'll get that also in the next Into the Spider-Verse film, which is coming out, I think, next year. So I'm fine with waiting on that, but it just would have been kind of cool to see a little bit more of that. Again, these are kind of just my own interpretations of the film. If you don't agree with me, that's perfectly fine. This is just kind of what I thought. And like I said, these are really just sort of nitpicks. Honestly, they're not even that big. The negative aspects of this film are pretty minor compared to the pros, which in my opinion are just fantastic. The good definitely far outweighs the bad in this film, as far as I'm concerned. The only other negative aspect I will say about it is this movie is it's 148 minutes long, so it's just shy of 2.5 hours. I would say for the most part, it does a good job of keeping the pacing in a nice smooth way. But there were moments where it kind of felt like it was kind of meandering just a little bit. There were just a couple moments in the movie where I was kind of checking my phone to see what time it was. Again, not a big deal, and I think for the most part, the movie does a really good job of not making you not feeling like it's 2.5 hours long, but just kind of a heads up for people. This is not a quick flick that you're going to go see. It's going to eat up a good chunk of your evening if you go see it late at night after work or something. Um, but yeah, so then I think after that, I'll just give my overall score of the film. I'm going to go ahead and say right now, I would say a solid 8.7 out of 10. I would have gone as high as a 9, but just the only reason I didn't was just because some of the negative aspects I had with the film just kind of prevented it from being, I would say, I would say into great territory. A really, really good Marvel film, but and just barely shy of the threshold of being a great Marvel film. But yeah, and again, for me at least, anything 8 and above, I would consider it has my recommendation to go see it, even go see it in theaters. So, like I said, 8.7, I mean, I would consider that a really good score. And honestly, this movie definitely has my recommendation. You know, if you get the chance to see it in theaters, I recommend it. Seeing Spider-Man swinging around on the big screen is always worth it, in my opinion. And if nothing else, seeing Garfield and Maguire return in their respective roles, and Molina and Defoe and the other villains from the previous films in this one is awesome to see too. And seeing it on the big screen, I think, is just worth it. So yeah, that was my overall review for Spider-Man: No Way Home. And then also, just to kind of go along with this, I am going to try to release these podcast episodes episodically. I'm going to try to discuss current events in entertainment, things that are coming out, new movies, video games. I will try to do reviews of movies and video games and things like that as well, kind of like what I just did tonight, get my overall score of them. So yeah, if you like what you heard, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will catch you guys next time.